Authentic Rebels, welcome back to our course, Ingenious Tactics 201, the course for people who see things differently. And today, we're going to pick up where we left off from before with our previous module, where we talked about the average versus actual return and how that actually works, and how predictable is your income really in retirement. And today, we're going to discuss about our model for how your money works, and we call that the Personal Economic Model, or PEM for short. And we're also going to talk about what we call a diverter valve conversation. And that'll make more sense when Brian explains it. So, Brian, I'll let you get into it.
Thanks, Kevin. So, nice to see you, everyone, again. Thanks for joining us, Authentic Rebels. We are on our screen looking at something called the Personal Economic Model. We call that PEM for short, P-E-M, Personal Economic Model. It's a picture, if you will, of what's going on with all of us financially. And let's kind of walk through this together so we can see a visual of what's going on with our money. You know, one of the problems we have found is that for a lot of people, numbers are not their thing, and it's hard to visualize, hard to get a picture of what's going on. And so this is a way to take away the numbers for a moment and get a visual, if you will, of what's actually going on economically for you. So, to start with, over on the left-hand side here, I'm drawing a little uneven circle.
It's all right.
We call this the income generator, or as you see what it says on there, lifetime capital potential, meaning this is all the money you're going to earn in your lifetime. And the result of that is that over time, we are going to, actually, let me back up for a second here. Couldn't see where my pointer was. So as you're earning income comes like this. It flows, becomes part of your monthly cash flow. And then, of course, the first thing that you have to do is you have to pay taxes. So we have down here the tax filter. The next thing you get to do is you get to decide what we call the lifestyle regulator, how much you're going to spend and how much you're going to save. What you spend, and in this scenario here, we're spending 80% of what we're earning. What we spend, of course, does not come back to us. Once it's spent, it doesn't come back, right?
Right.
Some money, however, hopefully gets saved. And what gets saved gets pushed up this tube called our future lifestyle tube, right? So current lifestyle is at the bottom down there in green. Future lifestyle is obviously what we're saving for our retirement. We get to put it in one of two tanks. We get to put it either in our investment tank or into our safe tank. Now, let's just talk about those two for a minute, okay? So, let's suppose that you have been saving for a while and you have some money in your investment tank. What is an investment, really? In the most basic sense, an investment has two things.
Well, it has the potential for a return.
Okay.
Right? And it has risk.
Yeah, so in other words, you put money in there because you want it to grow.
Right.
Right? And so that's the potential, as you were just saying. The problem is, as we know, that do you always make money when you invest?
Unfortunately, no.
No. So in other words, sometimes you can put money in, you think you have a certain amount, and then suddenly you have less.
Right.
Right? And that's, in fact, why we have no top on this tank. The reason is because, has anybody ever lost money in an investment?
I'm sure.
Happens, right?
Sure it happens.
It does happen. So that's the risk part of the tank. The other part is, and this is another type of risk, really, when you think about it, the red here is representing what? What do you suppose?
Well, that's some sort of risk, right? I'm going to guess it's government involved.
Yeah, well, it does, actually. That's going to represent taxes. So, in fact, let me go back for a second here. In fact, when you have a good investment return, right, meaning you have growth, you have capital appreciation, you have a partner in that. And not all of that is what you get to keep. So we represent that by the red. Now, depending on what happens with taxes, and in previous sessions we have talked quite a bit about taxes and the fact that they can go up and down, and they have gone up and down historically.
Yeah.
So you think you have a certain amount that's going to be yours, and then suddenly Uncle Sam decides to take a bigger piece of the pie. right? And you are left with less. That is tax risk as far as we're concerned. We don't know where that's going to end up, okay? But it obviously erodes whatever it is that you're earning.
Yep.
So that's the investment tank. Market risk, we'll call it, as well as tax risk.
Yep.
By contrast, let's look at the safe tank for a moment. In the safe tank, really we're talking about savings. Now, I like to differentiate between investments and savings, right? A lot of people will talk very casually about my savings and investments, right?
Sure.
And not really necessarily distinguish what those two are. But now that we know what the investment tank is, meaning that it has risk, both market and tax risk, on the safe side, if we could create a structure where we could do our best to eliminate both of those elements, both the market risk as well as possibly the tax risk, now that would be safe, right?
Right.
So let's talk about the market risk part for a moment. Is it possible to have a vehicle that actually grows annually, meaning that we know it can only grow linearly? It doesn't grow like this, like the market does, right?
Yeah.
Is that possible?
Yeah, sure.
There are vehicles out there that will do that will give us a predictable return, right, on an annual basis with never a loss, right? That's key, meaning it can never go this way. It only grows this way, all right? So that's the first part of being safe. How fast does it have to grow? Well, truthfully, it has to grow above or at least at inflation rate, right?
Right.
Otherwise, it's depreciating. So we'll keep that in mind as well. How does it have to grow? It has to grow linearly, upward only, not downward, for losses, and it has to grow at least a rate of inflation or better, right?
Yeah, makes sense.
And then taxes, is it possible to also either eliminate, that would be ideal,
Sure.
or reduce taxes? Is that possible?
Sure.
Okay.
Yeah.
So those two things would make it much safer, because then we don't have to worry about Uncle Sam taking a piece of the pie.
That would be a good thing. It's hungry sometimes.
That would be nice, right? So let's continue this conversation now, because at the top of the future lifestyle tube, we have what we call our savings and investment diverter, meaning we get to choose, right, where we're going to place our investments. Our money, our savings, do we place it into an investment, or do we put it into a savings situation? Okay. Well, let's look a little more closely at that. Okay. I'm going to click on that little diverter valve, and there are three issues that we're going to consider. The first one is risk, or what we're calling, generally speaking, market risk. Okay. Meaning things that you cannot diversify against. You know that if you invest in an index that imitates the S&P 500, for instance, that in some years you're going to have a positive return, and in some years, hopefully fewer years, you're going to have a negative return.
Yeah, hopefully fewer.
Right? That's market risk. And then, of course, as we've been talking about, there is tax risk, meaning I think I'm going to pay a 20% tax rate, but oops, they decided to raise taxes, and now I'm paying a 35% tax rate.
Right.
Or my tax bracket changed, right?
True.
If I'm successful.
We've seen that, yeah.
And then accessibility, or another word similar to that would be liquidity, meaning can I get to my money when I need it?
Uh-huh.
I may have said this before, but I'm going to repeat it. We believe that it is not a question of if you're going to need money, it's only a question of when.
Unfortunately, yes.
And when that happens, can you get to it without paying taxes or penalties?
Right, and we've talked about this in our podcast as well, as in this course here, liquidity, use, or control. And honestly, control is one of the most important factors when considering what you're going to do with your money and where it's going to be. It doesn't matter what you get for a rate of return if you don't have control over it, right? You got to have access. You got to be able to use it when you want.
You got to be able to use it when you want it.
For what you want.
Without taxes or penalties, hopefully.
Right.
That's
part
the key.
That's part of the control, right.
Okay, Kevin. So let's talk now for a moment about market risk. And we're going to just speak in general terms,
right,
at a high level. Let's suppose that you could place your money into one or all three buckets, meaning a high-risk bucket, a moderate-risk bucket, and a low-risk bucket, right?
Right.
Ideally speaking, where would you like to place your money? How much would you like in the high risk? How much would you like in the moderate risk bucket? And how much would you like in the low risk bucket?
Well, ideally, I want to eliminate my risk as much as possible, but I still want to realistically take advantage of some potential gains, right?
Okay.
Ideally, in our world, I would like to do, let's say 10% in the risk bucket.
High risk bucket.
Yeah, the high risk.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then how much in moderate?
Well, since moderate's a little less risky, maybe, let's say 15%.
Okay.
And then obviously the rest in
the bulk of it in the low risk bucket.
the low risk.
Okay. Now, let's take a moment and let's look at some of the characteristics of each of these potential buckets.
Right.
It is possible, because this is not really about a question of a number that you need to get for a return in order to make retirement possible, right?
Right.
This is more a question of, in my gut, what would I do? If I didn't have to consider that ideal rate of return as necessary for me to get to retirement, to make me comfortable, this is what I would do. And that's why, actually, when I do this conversation with people, spouses can have different answers for this.
Yeah.
Because some people are more aggressive and some people are more conservative naturally.
Right.
Okay? So for you, you might be leaning on the conservative side, but your spouse might be different. Right?
True.
She might say, I want a third in each.
Right.
Okay? So, but for you, you're a conservative guy, so this is where you would be.
Yep.
Now, in terms of characteristics, these are some of the types of things that would associate with these tanks, right? So the high risk would be quite volatile, meaning it's up and down, right? There is a potential for return, right? And there's certainly a lot of potential for loss as well.
Yep.
The moderate risk bucket has limited protection options, moderate volatility, limited liquidity, and moderate return potential. And finally, the low risk bucket has potential for guaranteed returns, right? Because why? Because we're only going to be growing in that scenario. No loss provisions, meaning that it is going to grow. We're not going to lose our money. And high liquidity is possible. And obviously, the return is going to be lower.
Right.
Right? Overall.
Right.
Okay. Let's continue.
But at least it's steady and I can count on it.
Yeah. So the next topic we're going to cover is tax buckets. Right now, we talked quite a bit about this in a previous session. If you haven't watched that session yet, which is called Qualified Plans, you should do that before we have this conversation to make sure you're clear about what these differences are. But generally speaking, there really are only three tax buckets. Forget about long-term versus short-term cap gains and that sort of thing. Really, even in those scenarios, there's really three buckets. There's taxable on an annual basis.
Right.
There's tax deferred, or again, we like to use the word tax postponed so that we know that we're going to have to pay it.
Yep.
Right?
Yep.
Just at some point. And tax advantage or tax-free, as we call it.
Right.
Okay. What goes along with each of these? Well, the taxable are after-tax contributions, ordinary taxes due on an annual return. You got to pay them.
Yeah, unfortunately.
Even in years in which your account balance decreased, for instance, if you own mutual funds, you could still have to pay taxes.
Right, because of the dividends.
Exactly. Capital gains due when you withdraw money, right? So if there were gains on the account, you would have to pay those taxes on those gains. And income does affect Social Security, meaning it is taxable for Social Security. Now, the tax postponed bucket or tax deferred bucket, the contributions are made with before tax dollars, sometimes after tax dollars, in the case of, for instance, a Roth, but before tax dollars for the most part. What type of taxes is it? Cap gains is ordinary. It is ordinary taxes due on the entire withdrawal, right? Entire withdrawal affects Social Security and undesirable if future taxes are higher, meaning, as we talked about in our previous module, if your tax bracket goes up because you are earning more money and you take it out at a higher tax bracket than you deferred at, right? If you deferred at 15 tax bracket and you took it out at 33, you lost on that deal.
Right?
If it goes the other way, if you deferred at 30 and you took it out at 15, and then obviously you won.
Right.
And then finally, tax advantage bucket, after-tax contributions, right? So if you earn $100,000 and you pay $30,000 in taxes and you contribute $70,000 to this bucket, that's an after-tax contribution. And therefore, you can also expect tax-free withdrawal if you play by the rules, whatever that, depending on the type of account that it is. But that's an awfully nice thing, right? The ability to not have to pay taxes on the growth, whatever that growth is, may require qualification and hopefully is invisible to Social Security.
Yeah, right.
Okay. So, question, Kevin, for you, and for Wealth Tax Rebels at home as well. Now that you've looked at the differences between these tax buckets, how much would you put in taxable, how much would you put in tax postponed, and how much would you put in tax advantaged? Again, ideally speaking.
Well,
you had your choice.
If I had my choice. Well, ideally. As much as I love to help my country, I don't want anything in taxable. I would like nothing to be taxable.
Right.
Right? But it's probably not the reality of what I would end up doing. And given what we've talked about with tax postponed and where it looks like taxes could be heading in the future based on history, that's a pretty risky place to put it too, which means I could end up paying a lot more tax. But at least there's a little bit of benefit there, potentially. But really, tax advantaged, when we're looking at these characteristics, I can get potentially all of the advantages I get in any of the other tax situations without having to pay any tax, which means I end up with a lot more money for myself. And that's really the situation I want to be in.
You potentially end up with more for yourself, but you also don't have to worry about how much you will have.
Right.
It's kind of unpredictable in the other situations because they're constantly changing the tax rates.
Right.
So tax advantage is the most predictable in that sense. So what are you saying, Kev?
So what I'm saying is, if I could have my choice, I'd want as much as I can, preferably everything, in tax advantage.
All right, so 100% tax-free.
Yeah.
Okay. Very good. Wealth Tax Rebels, you want to pay more tax? That's up to you. But tax advantage, tax-free, ideally speaking, if you could do it.
Yep.
All right, we'll come back to that idea. So, now let's talk about your investments. Okay, what do you currently have for investments?
So currently, I have some equities, right?
Okay.
And I have about $15,000 in that.
Okay, $15,000. And what kind of tax bucket is that?
Well, that's the taxable.
Taxable, right. Okay.
Right.
High risk, low risk, moderate risk?
Well, that's somewhat moderate.
Those are individual securities?
Yeah.
All right, so individual securities, because they're individual companies that can go out, we would call that high risk.
Okay.
And then accessible, meaning you can get to it without paying taxes or penalties?
No.
Okay, you got to pay taxes for sure.
Yeah, definitely have to pay taxes.
Okay, what else do you have?
I have a 401k.
All right, so the 401k, and what's that balance approximately?
About $85,000.
$85,000, okay. And what type of tax is that?
That's postponed. Yeah, it's pretty much mostly used of mutual funds.
Okay, so mutual funds, we're going to call that medium risk. Okay?
Right.
And again, accessible without taxes or penalties.
Definitely not.
All right. Anything else?
Well, I mean, I have my 529 plan, but I know that's not accessible other than college funding.
Well, that's not for your retirement.
So
right?
yeah, it's not my retirement.
Okay. And maybe you have a little bit of cash, but again, that's just
just my
for cash flow expenses.
Right. Exactly.
Okay. Great. You also have a house.
Yeah, we have a house.
But that's something that, again, if you're going to have a place to live, you're not going to spend that either.
Right.
So we're not going to put that here either.
Right.
Okay, so what that means is that of your liquid assets, the $100,000, none of it is accessible currently without taxes or penalties.
Right.
How do you feel about that?
Not where I really want to be. I don't feel comfortable about that at all.
Okay. A lot of people, and we haven't talked a lot about this, but a lot of people feel that, well, I have 401k, I could always take a loan.
Right.
Right? We're going to look a little more closely at that later on in our course, but that may or may not be the case. There are very limited reasons that you can take a loan from the 401k. And if you take a distribution, you pay 10% penalty tax. You may not even be able to get it out of the employer's plan at all. They may not even give you a distribution.
Yeah, right.
Very limited liquidity. And in the equities, yeah, you can sell it, but again, you still have to pay the tax.
Right.
Okay.
Who knows what that'll be?
All right, so now let's look at the combination of all of these things. So across the bottom here in the blue is what you said ideally you would like.
Right.
Okay, now Wealth Tactic Rebels, you might have a slightly different answer here, but try to picture, if you will, what it is. Remember, he said he wanted 100% tax advantage, so that's the bottom line. That's all tax advantaged or tax-free. 10% in high risk, 15% in moderate risk, 75% in low risk.
Right.
Okay? Yours might be a little bit different.
Yeah, conservative. Yeah.
Here's where Kevin's assets are today, right, for our case study. It's not the same, is it?
No, not at all. It looks
It's
kind of the opposite.
just not quite the same. So when we put those two together, you can now see side by side that what you have, which is the yellow, does not equal what you want,
Right.
ideally speaking.
Right.
So, Kevin, what does this kind of tell us we would need to do in order to get you into a position that you were most comfortable with?
Well, I think we need to start moving what I've been doing into where I want to be.
Yeah. So, in other words, we got to find a way to direct some of this money in this position, correct?
Right.
And hopefully, we can move as much as possible down into that direction as well. Right? We're going to move some this way.
Yep.
And we can hopefully move some of it this way.
Right.
Okay? Now, I always tell people when we get to this point, I say, well, now that you know what you'd ideally like, let me ask you something. How long has it taken you to get to where you are today?
Well, it's taken me a long time.
It's taken some time, right?
Yeah.
All right. So it's also going to take some time to reposition and to create this strategy. But now at least that you know what you want, which is different than before. Right? And Wealth Tactic Rebels, if you're looking at your chart, and if you did this with your chart, obviously I can't do it for you today, if your plan currently is not what you would ideally like, how are you going to get there? Well, that's what we're going to talk about next in our following sessions.
Right.
Okay?
So Wealth Tactic Rebels joining our Wealth Tactic Rebel course today, or anyone for the first time. So in our module today, we have covered what we call the personal economic model, which gives a great overview of how your money works in your life. And we've also talked about what we'd call the diverter valve conversation, where we talk about where your money is currently versus where you would ideally like it to go, and being able to get it there. So look at your own chart and say to yourself, where am I today? And where do I want to be in regards to the tax buckets and the risk buckets? So, Brian, thank you for helping explain today to everyone what's going on with their personal economic model and their buckets. And thank you for joining us for today's module, and we'll talk to you again soon. Have a fantastic day.